Okay, today we start a new read aloud. This one is called Who Was George Washington Carver by Jim Gigliotti. So let's start with the introduction. Who was George Washington Carver? Mrs. Baynard looked out at her garden, but she didn't like what she saw. Mrs. Baynard lived in the biggest house in Diamond Grove, Missouri, in the mid-1870s. Inside the house, everything was in order, pretty paintings and nice furniture. But outside in the garden, her roses weren't blooming. Why not? She wondered. Her friend Susan Carver's roses were blooming. Her roses were big and beautiful and bright red. Mrs. Carver lived on a nearby farm. Mrs. Baynard went over and asked what her secret was to growing such perfect flowers. "It's our George," Mrs. Carver said. "He's the one who knows about roses." George was the 10-year-old boy who lived with Mrs. Carver. She was his foster mother. Mrs. Carver had been taking care of George since he was a baby, and George had been taking care of Mrs. Carver's plants and flowers. Actually, George helped out around the farm in many ways. He loved Mrs. Carver as if she were his own mother. He would have done just about anything she asked, but he was especially happy when she asked him to help with her garden. So George went over to Mrs. Baynard's house to take a look at her roses. He knew right away what was wrong. Her roses needed to be moved to a different part of the garden where they could get more sun. He moved the plants and soon they were in full bloom. Word spread quickly, and young George started helping many of Mrs. Carver's friends with their plants and flowers. One week, a neighbor needed help with her lilies. Another week, a friend asked for help with her begonias. George always seemed to know how to fix whatever problem there was. Soon he became known as a plant doctor. George never lost that helpful spirit, nor his love for plants and the best way to grow them. He was George Washington Carver, and he used his passion for nature to become one of the most famous and helpful scientists in the world. Chapter 1. Orphaned. George Washington Carver was born into slavery in Diamond Grove, Missouri near the end of the American Civil War, which was fought from 1861 to 1865. George was black. His owners, Moses and Susan Carver, were white. Moses and Susan were German immigrants. They didn't like slavery, but they had a 240-acre farm that needed much work. And Missouri had entered the Union in 1820 as a slave state. In 1855, the Carvers purchased a 13-year-old slave girl named Mary. They treated Mary well and were happy for her when she gave birth to a son named Jim in 1859. Several years later, George was born. No one knows exactly when George was born because most records among slave owners were poorly kept. Most likely, George was born in 1864. His father, Giles, was a slave who was owned by a neighbor of the Carvers. He was killed in a farming accident not long after George's birth. No one knows exactly how many brothers or sisters George had. George lived with Mary and Jim in a small cabin on the Carver farm. The cabin was the original house on the farm. Moses and Susan had since built a larger house and they lived in that one. One night, when George was still an infant, he was asleep in a cabin. Suddenly, there was the sound of men on horseback. Moses knew what that meant. Twice before, his farm had been attacked by raiders called bushwhackers who were fighting on the Confederate or the Southern side in the Civil War. Missouri's role in the Civil War was complicated. Even though Missouri was a slave state, many of the people who lived there were against slavery. So some men on the Union or Northern side fought for Missouri to remain as one of the United States and to free the slaves. But some of Missouri's men fought to create a separate nation that would keep slavery legal. They were on the Confederate side. Moses was caught in the middle. He had slaves, but since he also wanted slavery to be illegal, he upset people on both sides. The bushwhackers wanted to take the slaves and sell them in a nearby state, such as Arkansas. Moses raced to the cabin and called out for Mary. Moses grabbed Jim, and Mary grabbed George. Moses and Jim escaped, but it was too late for Mary and George. The men grabbed her and her baby, and they galloped away into the night. The next day, Moses hurried to Neosho, Missouri, which was about 8 miles away. There was a man in Neosho who was a scout for the Union side. The man might know where to look for Mary and George. Several days later, the scout came back. He was clutching George, who was very sick with whooping cough, but alive. There was no sign of Mary. The raiders had abandoned George. Mary was never heard from again. Jim and George were left without a father or a mother, but Moses and Susan were determined to give the boys a family. The Carvers moved Jim and George into the main house and treated them as if they were their own children. Even though the 13th Amendment freed all slaves in 1865, the boys stayed with the Carvers, whom they called Uncle Moses and Aunt Susan. George was known simply as Carver's George. The end of slavery. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a big moment in U.S. history. The proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. It was declared that the slaves in the 10 states fighting on the Confederate or Southern side in the Civil War were free. Technically, the Emancipation Proclamation had little effect. The Confederate states had tried to leave the Union and weren't about to honor anything Lincoln said. But it was very important because it made clear that the Civil War wasn't just about saving the Union, but also was about ending slavery. When the Union, Northern side, won the war, slavery was over everywhere in the United States. It became official when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution took effect on December 6, 1865. Chapter 2. Every day, George explored the fields and flowers and animals on the Carver farm. It was a big farm about the size of 180 football fields. Moses and Susan grew corn, wheat, and potatoes. They raised cows, pigs, and horses. There was always plenty of work to do on the farm. Jim and George were expected to help the other farmhands as much as they could. Jim was big and did some of the chores that took strength, such as plowing the fields. But George never seemed to be fully healthy after he recovered from whooping cough as a baby. He was often sick. My body was very feeble, and it was a constant warfare between life and death to see who would gain the mastery, he once wrote. Because he was often sick and not very strong, George was excused from the heavy-duty work on the farm, but he still wanted to be helpful, so he did what he could, such as taking care of the plants and flowers and feeding the animals. George didn't go to school as a youngster, but he still had quite an education on the farm. From Moses, he learned to waste nothing. Moses believed that everything the family needed to live was available right there on the farm. From Susan, George learned how to sew, cook, and clean. Susan even made her own clothes with the help of a spinning wheel she kept in the house. When George was 8 years old, he was baptized a Christian. Because he loved nature so much, George always referred to God as Creator. George went to church on Sundays, about a mile away from the farm. During the week, he played with the neighborhood kids. Most of them were white, and he learned to get along with people no matter what color they were. Mrs. Baynard was white. One day, when George was helping her with her roses, she showed him the paintings in her house. George decided he wanted to paint pictures like that. He didn't have any brushes or paint or canvas or paper, but Moses had taught him to make good use of whatever was available. So George squeezed the juice out of some berries, took a small stick, and started painting on a flat rock. When George wasn't working or playing, he took long walks in fields and the woods, talking to plants and flowers and caring for them. He cleared a spot in the woods where he kept his own little nursery, a special place for plants. Strange to say, all sorts of vegetation, plant life, seemed to thrive under my touch, he said. He collected rocks, too, and stashed them by the chimney in a corner of the house. Susan would make him clean out the corner, but the pile would soon grow again. George was incredibly curious. He wanted to learn everything he could about the plants and flowers and animals he saw every day. When he saw a coneflower, he wanted to know why it was purple. When he saw a black-eyed Susan, he wanted to know how it got its name. Sometimes Moses and Susan knew the answers, but not always. The Carvers had an old spelling book. George read the book cover to cover, but it didn't have the answers he was looking for either. George wanted to go to school and learn all that he could. Diamond Grove's school was in the same building where George went for church on Sundays. One day, he and Jim walked to the school. Imagine George's excitement at finally being able to find the answers to all of his questions. And imagine his disappointment at being told that the school was for white children only. The kids George went to church with on Sundays and played with in the neighborhood could go to school, but he and Jim couldn't. They walked back home. Jim went right back to helping out on the farm, but that wasn't enough for George. He didn't give up his dream of going to school. When he was about 13, George went to Moses and Susan and told them he wanted to leave. They were the only parents he had ever known, and he loved them very much. But he wanted to go to school. His plan was to hike to Neosho, which had the nearest school for black children. Moses and Susan always said the boys were free and they could leave if they wished, so they didn't stop George. The next day, Susan packed up some snacks for George and he began the long walk to Neosho. By the time George made it to Neosho, the snacks were long gone. It was getting dark fast. George didn't know anybody in the town and he didn't have any money. He was tired and he was hungry. George spotted a barn. He'd grown up on a farm, so a barn was a friendly place. There was no one inside. He set down his belongings and soon was fast asleep. So next time we'll read Chapter 3, School Days.